Extending the growing season into the fall and winter here in Zone 5 without using artificial heat can be a challenge, and I'm always looking for new ways to both grow more food in the fall and winter and to make it easier. For example, building this hoop house last fall made a big difference. It expanded our growing space a bit, and it allows us to get in from the cold and harvest crops in relative comfort in midwinter. And this year, outside the hoop house, I'm making changes to our cold frames and low tunnels to make fall and winter gardening both easier and more bountiful. Let's start by looking at a couple changes I made here in the hoop house. First, I modified our old cold frames so that they stand upright and can accommodate taller plants like tree collards and perpetual spinach. The changes also make it easier to vent the cold frames and to harvest from them. The cold frames sit on top of the raised bed, with the glass top slanting up toward the sun. Though there are two lids, there's no panel dividing the interior. The cold frames can be vented by propping the windows open and by opening the panels on top. We can harvest some of the taller plants like tree collards through the top, but most crops are harvested by tilting the glass forward or by removing the glass. Because I created this new design from our old cold frames, we were able to use only repurposed materials except for the new back panel. Second, I changed how we secure our low tunnel hoops to the top of the raised bed to make it easier to open and close the low tunnels and to provide a more airtight seal between the plastic and the top of the raised bed. The hoop pipes used to fit into wood blocks like this that were fastened to the top of the raised bed. Unfortunately, the blocks got in the way and made it more difficult to create an airtight seal between the greenhouse plastic and the raised bed. The new design secures the pipes to the raised bed using PVC end caps. I simply drilled holes in the end caps, fastened them to the top of the bed with screws, and inserted the hoops. Now I have an unobstructed surface to secure the plastic to. Since I'll only be opening the low tunnels from the inside of the hoop house, I'll secure the plastic on the outside by pinching it under 1x2 furring strips. On the inside, where I'll be opening the low tunnel, I'll use rebar to weigh down the plastic and create a relatively airtight seal. Now let's take a look at some of the changes we're making outside of the hoop house to make fall and winter growing easier and more bountiful. For many years before we even had our hoop house, we grew cold-hardy crops in the fall and winter under low tunnels and cold frames, and sometimes cold frames inside of low tunnels. The extra protection allowed us to grow many of these crops well into the winter, and some all the way through the winter. But as you can imagine, when it's cold outside and there's a lot of snow on the ground, it's a bit of a hassle to have to unclip and remove the cover from a low tunnel and then open up a cold frame to access crops. To make it easier to grow cold-hardy crops under 2 layers of protection in winter, I'm experimenting with a simple hinged low tunnel design on a couple of our raised beds. The design includes both inner and outer hoops, which will both be covered with 6mm greenhouse plastic during the winter. And to harvest, I'll just lift the top and pick my favorite cold-hardy crops. The inner and outer hoops are attached to a wooden frame that sits on top of a raised bed. They're attached using the same approach I showed earlier with PVC end caps. The frame is hinged on one side to allow the top to be raised for easy access to crops. Just before the temperatures start dipping below freezing, I'll cover the inner layer with 6mm greenhouse plastic. And then probably in December, when temperatures are regularly below freezing, I'll cover the outer layer as well. The plastic will stay in place until late winter when I remove the outer layer, and then sometime in the spring I'll remove the inner layer. I'll occasionally have to vent the low tunnels by propping them open, but by waiting until it's quite cold before covering both sets of hoops, I shouldn't have to vent often. Obviously, venting increases the risk of damage from high winds. So that's the basic design so far. I plan on releasing a complete how-to video when the project is complete. That video will show the construction in detail, as well as address issues like venting and dealing with the wind. Now let's look at how we're expanding our growing space this winter. This compost bin is in one of the sunniest spots in our garden this time of year, so I thought it made sense to use this space to also grow food. To make this possible, I built this small raised bed and cold frame out of repurposed wood, screws, and an old storm window. The raised bed sits on top of several layers of cardboard and is lined with cardboard to keep the soil in place. 2 roofing nails keep the cover from sliding off, and I vent the cold frame on warm, sunny days by propping the cover open. Inside we're growing lettuce, spinach, claytonia, and parsley. I'll cover the compost bin and raised bed with a low tunnel in December, which should provide enough protection for the spinach, claytonia, and possibly the lettuce to survive through the winter. Next, for the first time ever, we'll soon expand our fall and winter garden into the front yard, where we'll plant kale in fire rings under protection. As you can see, the eggplants and peppers in the fire rings are just about done for the year. We'll harvest the last of them soon and plant the kale in their place. When temperatures start dipping below freezing, we'll cover the kale with a cold frame to keep it going through the winter. Finally, the last thing I'm thinking about doing will allow us to grow more food in this area where we just cut back our sunchoke flowers. We don't harvest all of our sunchokes after cutting back the flowers. Instead, in the past, we covered the bed with storm windows to keep the soil from freezing and harvested the sunchokes as needed through the fall and winter. But given the limited amount of sunny growing space in winter, it sure would be great if we could continue to store the sunchokes here, but also grow a new crop at the same time. So what I'm thinking about doing is building 2 small closed bottom raised beds with cold frames that will sit on top of this raised bed, and I'll plant kale in them. This will allow us to store our sunchokes all winter long in the soil on the bottom bed, while growing kale on top, and the beds on top will be light enough that I can remove them to harvest the sunchokes underneath. I hope this video gave you some ideas on how you can grow more food in the fall and winter where you live, and how you can make it a little bit easier. To give you a better idea of exactly what we're growing in our fall and winter garden here in Zone 5, I'll share pictures along with the names of some of the crops we're growing this year. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe for more videos on how to grow a lot of food on a little land without spending much or working harder than you have to.
Get it, Oscar.